The morning's first pipe tobacco when Constance Merrick found the foreclosure notice wedged beneath the brass scale her husband had used to weigh rice samples. She did not touch it at first. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. The paper lay face up on the walnut desk, its printed letterhead, State Bank of South Carolina, Charleston Branch, visible even in the dim light filtering through shutters still closed against the June heat. Outside, the house servants were already moving through the corridors of Merrick Hall, their footfalls muted on cypress floors polished to a mirror sheen by 3 generations of hands she had inherited along with the mortgage. She lifted the document. The language was direct. Failure to remit the balance of $4,200 by the 20th of August would result in seizure of collateral properties enumerated in the original indenture of March 1847. Beneath the formal prose, an addendum listed those properties by name and appraised value: 17 enslaved persons, the count precise down to the infant born in January, whom the bank had already factored into its arithmetic. Land, timber rights, and standing cotton were mentioned only secondarily. The bank wanted its human collateral first. Constance set the notice down and opened the plantation journal her husband had kept until his death 11 months prior. Nathaniel Merrick's hand had grown increasingly cramped in his final year, the script narrowing as fever and flux drained him through the humid autumn of 1848. She turned to the last entry, dated October 9th. He had recorded only the day's temperature, 81 degrees at noon, and the words, "Spoke to Tillman, spring planting." No mention of the debts. No acknowledgement that he had borrowed against their people to finance a cotton gin that now sat rusting in the barn, its mechanism flawed, its manufacturer bankrupt, and vanished into the interior territories. She had discovered the full scope only after the funeral, when Mr. Grayson, their attorney, arrived with the estate papers. Nathaniel had signed 3 separate notes. The first, in 1845, to expand acreage. The second, in 1846, to purchase the gin. The third, in early 1847, to cover shortfalls when the gin failed and cotton prices dipped. Each note used the same 17 souls as collateral, a legal practice Mr. Grayson assured her was entirely common. The bank held a lien that superseded even a widow's dower rights. If she could not pay, the people would be sold at the Charleston market individually to satisfy the debt. The house and land would follow. Mr. Grayson had offered one avenue. Her brother-in-law, Thomas Merrick, owned a coastal shipping concern and had expressed willingness to assume the debt in exchange for Constance signing over her widow's share, 1/3 of the estate, and agreeing to serve as housekeeper for his own plantation, Prospect Point, 12 miles north. She would retain her personal effects, a small annuity, and her dignity, such as it was. The enslaved workers would remain together, though under Thomas's title. Constance had thanked Mr. Grayson for his counsel and asked for time to consider. That had been in August of 1848. It was now June of 1849, and she had not written to Thomas. She closed the journal and walked to the sideboard where a small apothecary case sat beside the brandy decanter. The case had belonged to her mother, who had taught her the rudiments of household physic before Constance married at 19. Inside, glass vials stood in neat rows: tincture of opium, camphor spirits, laudanum with saffron, and a newer edition, Fowler's solution, an arsenic tonic prescribed by Dr. Bellamy for Nathaniel during his final illness. The doctor had recommended 15 drops twice daily to stimulate appetite and calm nervous agitation. Nathaniel had taken it faithfully for 6 weeks. Though whether it eased his suffering or merely prolonged it, Constance could not say. The bottle was 3/4 full. She had begun measuring her own days by the tasks that filled them. Monday was accounts. Tuesday, inspection of the kitchen garden and smokehouse. Wednesday, mending and correspondence. Thursday, a visit to the parish church to arrange flowers for Sunday services. Friday, the supervision of laundry. Saturday, meal planning. Sunday, worship and rest. Each task required her presence, her attention, her authority. Without them, the house would drift into disorder, and disorder was the first symptom of decline. She had seen it happen to the Fenton family after old Mr. Fenton died. The house sold within a year. The widow relocated to live with a married daughter in Columbia. The enslaved workers dispersed at auction. Constance had attended the sale. She remembered the auctioneer's voice, dry and businesslike, as he called out ages and skills and sold a mother separately from her children, because the bids came in that way. She would not let that happen here. The door to the counting room opened, and Letty, the housemaid, entered carrying a tray with Constance's morning tea. Letty was 42, born in the quarters behind the main house, trained from girlhood to move soundlessly through rooms and anticipate needs before they were spoken. She set the tray on the desk without disturbing the foreclosure notice and stepped back, eyes lowered. "Thank you, Letty," Constance said. "Has Mr. Tillman returned from Beaufort yet?" "No, ma'am, still at market. Cook says he'll be back by dinner." "Very well. Tell Cook I'll take luncheon in the garden. Cold chicken and greens will do." "Yes, ma'am." Letty withdrew, and Constance poured the tea. It was strong and bitter, the way she preferred it. She added no sugar. Sugar was a luxury now to be reserved for guests or special occasions. She took a sip and opened the plantation ledger to the current week. 17 names, each followed by a column noting tasks assigned, tasks completed, rations distributed, medical complaints, and a final column labeled condition. That column was Constance's own addition. She had begun filling it in after Nathaniel died, using a shorthand only she understood. Fair, good, weak, compliant, sullen. The words helped her track who could be trusted, who might run, who required watching. She had not expected to become an overseer. That role had belonged to Mr. Tillman, a free man of color who had worked for Nathaniel's father and stayed on after the old man's death. Tillman was competent and quiet, a man who understood the rhythms of planting and harvest and asked few questions. But he had no authority to make decisions about sale or purchase, and he would not negotiate with banks. Those tasks fell to Constance. She studied the names. At the top, Samuel, 41, field foreman. Then Bess, his wife, 38, kitchen. Then their children, Gabriel, 16, field hand. Mary, 14, house. Jonah, 11, stable. Dinah, 8, learning kitchen work. And the infant, Ruth, 6 months, still nursing. Below them, 10 others, field hands, a carpenter, a midwife, a boy who tended chickens. Together, they represented the bank's primary interest. Together, they were worth more than the land. She had considered selling a few of them privately, using the proceeds to reduce the debt. But partial payment would not satisfy the bank, and word of a sale would spread quickly through the town. People would know she was failing. Creditors she had not yet heard from would come forward. The spiral would accelerate. She needed a different solution. The idea had come to her in May, during a conversation at the Whitfield plantation. She had been invited to a small dinner. Mrs. Whitfield was a cousin by marriage, and the talk had turned, as it always did, to property and politics. Mr. Whitfield mentioned a neighbor who had recently lost his entire labor force to a bank seizure. The man had tried to contest the sale, claiming the bank had acted prematurely, but the courts ruled against him. He was ruined. His wife had taken ill shortly after and died within 3 months. Mr. Whitfield recounted these facts with a tone of mild regret, as though describing a blighted crop. Then he turned to another guest and asked about cotton futures in Charleston. Constance had said nothing during the exchange. She had sipped her wine, a claret, well-aged, and listened to the other women discuss a parish charity drive. But the words stayed with her. His wife had taken ill shortly after and died within 3 months. She began researching the matter discreetly. She wrote to an acquaintance in Columbia, a widow herself, who had survived a similar crisis by remarrying quickly to a man with means. The acquaintance sent back a candid letter. Remarriage was indeed the surest path to security. provided one could endure the scrutiny and the speed. Courtship in the wake of mourning was a delicate performance. One had to appear both sufficiently grieved and sufficiently available. Missteps were noted. Constance thanked her for the advice and set the letter aside. She had also spoken with Dr. Bellamy during one of his monthly visits to the parish. He was 60, widowed, and well-regarded. She asked him about the general health of widows in the county, framing her inquiry as concern for her own constitution. He told her that grief often manifested as bodily weakness, loss of appetite, insomnia, palpitations, digestive complaints. He recommended moderate exercise, regular meals, and a tonic. He suggested she continue taking Fowler's solution, though at a reduced dose. 10 drops daily would suffice for maintenance of vitality. She thanked him and filled the prescription, but she did not take it. Instead, she began to study it. She read the label carefully. Fowler's solution of potassium arsenite for nervous debility, skin complaints, and intermittent fevers. The directions recommended doses between 5 and 15 drops, with warnings against exceeding 20 drops per day. She uncorked the bottle and sniffed. The liquid was clear and nearly odorless, with a faint metallic undertone. She dipped a clean glass rod into it and touched the rod to her tongue. The taste was bitter, sharply so, but not unbearable. It could be masked by stronger flavors, brandy, perhaps, or coffee. She returned to the counting room desk and opened a small drawer where she kept her personal correspondence. Among the letters was one from Thomas Merrick, dated 3 weeks prior. In it, he reiterated his offer to assume the debt and invited her to visit Prospect Point to discuss terms. His tone was cordial, but firm. He expected an answer by the end of June. She read the letter twice, then folded it and placed it back in the drawer. That evening, she composed a reply. She thanked Thomas for his patience and informed him that she had decided to accept his generous offer. However, given the distance and the complexity of the legal arrangements, she proposed that he visit Merrick Hall for a final consultation. She suggested the first week of July, when the weather would be cooler and the roads passable. She would arrange for a supper, a small affair to mark the transition of the estate. Mr. Grayson could attend as well, to witness the signing of documents. She closed the letter with appropriate expressions of gratitude and signed her name in the careful script her mother had taught her. The next morning, she rode into Beaufort and posted the letter herself. The town was quiet, the streets shaded by ancient oaks draped with Spanish moss. She passed the market where a slave auction was underway, the auctioneer's voice carrying across the square. She did not stop to watch. At the post office, she handed the letter to the clerk, paid the postage, and left without speaking to anyone else. On the ride back to Merrick Hall, she felt a calmness she had not known in months. The sky was cloudless, the heat already climbing toward the oppressive weight of midday, but the breeze off the river brought a faint coolness. She thought of the supper she would host. The menu would be simple but elegant. Cold meats, rice, greens from the garden, a summer pudding. She would use the good china, the set with the blue willow pattern that had belonged to Nathaniel's mother. She would light candles in the dining room and open the windows to admit the evening air. She would pour wine from the cellar, a Madeira that had aged since before the Mexican War. Everything would be done correctly, according to the forms of hospitality that governed such occasions, and she would add the tonic to Thomas's glass herself. The calculation was straightforward. A fatal dose of arsenic was estimated at 60 to 180 milligrams, depending on the victim's weight and health. Fowler's solution contained 1% potassium arsenite, roughly 1 milligram per drop. If she administered 50 drops over the course of an evening, 10 in the first glass of Madeira, 10 in the second, 20 in the after-supper brandy, and 10 more in a final cordial, she could approach the lower threshold. Symptoms would begin within hours: nausea, abdominal pain, vomiting, diarrhea. Thomas would attribute it to something he ate. He would retire to the guest chamber. By morning, if the dose was sufficient, he would be too weak to ride. Dr. Bellamy would be summoned. He would diagnose cholera or flux, both common in the summer months. If Thomas died, the death would be tragic but unremarkable. If he survived, he would be weakened enough to delay his plans, and she would have time to seek other options. She had considered the risks. If the dose was too small, he would recover quickly and suspect nothing. If too large, he would die too obviously and questions might be asked. She would need to balance the amount carefully to produce illness severe enough to incapacitate but not so severe as to seem unnatural. She would also need to ensure that no one else consumed the poisoned wine. That meant marking the glasses, serving Thomas first, and clearing his place settings herself. The plan required precision. It also required resolve. She reached Merrick Hall as the sun climbed toward noon. The house stood at the end of a long avenue of oaks, its white columns bright against the surrounding green. It looked, as it always had, like a place of order and permanence. She dismounted and handed the reins to Jonah, who led the horse to the stable without a word. Inside, the house was cool and dim, the shutters drawn. Letty appeared to take her hat and gloves. "Any messages, Letty?" "No, ma'am. Mr. Tillman's back, though. Says the cotton prices are holding steady." "Good. Tell him I'll see him after luncheon." She climbed the stairs to her chamber and removed her riding dress. She washed her face and hands in the basin, the water tepid and faintly scented with lavender. Then she sat at her dressing table and studied her reflection. She was 34, still handsome, though the past year had left marks. Fine lines at the corners of her eyes, a tightness in her jaw that had not been there before. Her mother had always said that a woman's face revealed her character, and Constance wondered what hers revealed now. She thought of Thomas Merrick. He was 47, robust, a man who enjoyed good food and good company. He had never married, preferring the management of his business to the complications of domestic life. He had no children. If he died intestate, his estate would pass to his closest living relatives, including Constance, his brother's widow. She would inherit a share, perhaps enough to settle the debt and keep Merrick Hall. It was a possibility worth considering. She opened the drawer of her dressing table and removed a small notebook. In it, she had begun recording dosages and timings, practicing the calculations as one might practice a recipe. She turned to a fresh page and wrote the date, June 14, 1849. Beneath it, she noted the proposed menu and the order of service. Then she wrote in small, precise letters, 50 drops, distributed across 4 servings. Monitor response. Adjust as needed. She closed the notebook and locked it in the drawer. That afternoon, she walked to the kitchen to speak with Cook. The kitchen stood separate from the main house, a brick building with a wide hearth and a work table scarred by decades of use. Cook was a woman named Hester, 60 years old, heavy-bodied, with hands that moved through tasks with the efficiency of long habit. She looked up when Constance entered, her expression neutral. "I'll be hosting a supper in 2 weeks," Constance said. "My brother-in-law will be visiting along with Mr. Grayson. I want a proper meal, nothing ostentatious but well prepared. Can you manage that?" "Yes, ma'am. How many guests?" 3, including myself. We'll dine in the main house in the dining room. I'll need the table set with the good china, and I'll need wine, Madeira and brandy. Check the cellar and bring up 2 bottles of each. I'll select which ones to serve." "Yes, ma'am. One more thing. I'll be serving the wine myself. You're not to pour or handle the glasses. I'll take care of that." Cook's eyes flicked up, briefly, then dropped again. "Yes, ma'am." Constance left the kitchen and returned to the house. The afternoon stretched ahead, long and hot. She spent it in the counting room, reviewing the ledgers once more, checking her arithmetic. The numbers did not change. The debt remained. The deadline approached, but she had a plan now, and she had the means. Thomas Merrick's reply arrived on the 23rd of June, brought by a postal courier who rode in from Beaufort just after the midday heat had settled over the house. Constance read the letter in the counting room with the door closed. Thomas accepted her invitation. He would arrive on the evening of July 5th and remain through the 7th. Mr. Grayson would accompany him, and both men expected to finalize the estate transfer during their visit. Thomas concluded with a note of relief. "I am pleased you have come to see reason in this matter. Nathaniel would have wanted the property kept whole." She folded the letter and placed it in the drawer with the others. 12 days. She had 12 days to prepare. The first task was to determine the correct dosage. She had read enough in the household medical guides to know that arsenic accumulated in the body over time, and that symptoms could be delayed or protracted depending on the victim's constitution. A single massive dose would provoke immediate and violent illness, likely to arouse suspicion. A series of smaller doses, administered over the course of an evening, might produce symptoms that mimicked natural illness, flux, cholera, or simple gastric distress brought on by rich food and summer heat. She returned to the apothecary case and removed the bottle of Fowler's solution. The label listed the concentration, 1% potassium arsenite. She had calculated that 50 drops would deliver approximately 50 milligrams of arsenic. Medical literature suggested that 60 milligrams could be fatal to a man of average health, though the threshold varied. Thomas was robust, well-fed, and accustomed to wine. She would need to exceed the minimum. On the morning of June 24th, she began her first trial. Not on Thomas, that would come later, but on herself, in a controlled measure. She placed a single drop of Fowler's solution into a glass of water and drank it. The taste was faintly metallic but unremarkable. She felt no immediate effect. Over the next 4 hours, she monitored herself for symptoms: nausea, dizziness, abdominal discomfort. There were none. The dose was far too small to produce harm as she had expected, but the trial confirmed that the solution could be ingested without immediate detection. The following day, she increased the trial. She added 2 drops to her morning tea. Again, no discernible taste beyond the bitterness of the tea itself. She drank it and waited. By afternoon, she noticed a faint queasiness, but it passed within an hour. She recorded the result in her notebook. 2 drops, mild effect, insufficient. She did not dare test higher doses on herself. Instead, she turned her attention to the household animals. On the 26th, she mixed 5 drops of Fowler's solution into a dish of milk and set it out for one of the barn cats, a gray tom that Jonah had been feeding despite her instructions not to encourage strays. The cat lapped up the milk and wandered off. She checked on it an hour later. It was lying in the shade of the barn, panting, its sides heaving. By evening, it had vomited twice and refused food. By the next morning, it was dead. She told Jonah to bury it and said nothing more. The trial had been instructive. 5 drops delivered at once had killed an animal weighing perhaps 8 pounds within 24 hours. A man weighing 180 pounds would require significantly more, perhaps 40 to 60 drops, possibly more if distributed over time to allow the body to process and expel some of the poison. She revised her calculations. She would aim for 70 drops, divided across 4 servings. That would provide a margin of safety, or rather a margin of certainty. But the dosing was only one element. She also needed to ensure that the poison could not be traced. She had heard, in passing, of new methods for detecting arsenic in human remains. A chemist in England, Marsh, she thought his name was, had devised a test that could reveal arsenic even in small quantities. The test had been used in a famous trial some years back. A woman in France who had poisoned her husband with arsenic-laced cake. The woman had been convicted and imprisoned. Constance did not know if the test was available in South Carolina. Dr. Bellamy had never mentioned it. The nearest chemist capable of performing such an analysis would be in Charleston, and Charleston was 2 days' journey by coach. Still, the risk existed. She considered the problem carefully. If Thomas died at Merrick Hall, there would be an inquest. Dr. Bellamy would be called to examine the body and determine cause of death. If he suspected poisoning, he might order further tests. But suspicion required evidence, and evidence required a reason to look. If Thomas's death appeared consistent with cholera or gastric fever, both common in July, there would be no cause for deeper inquiry. The symptoms of arsenic poisoning closely resembled those diseases: vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, dehydration. If she could ensure that Thomas exhibited those symptoms and if she could establish a plausible alternative cause, the death would be recorded as natural. To that end, she needed accomplices, though they would not know it. On June 28th, she rode into Beaufort and stopped at the market. She purchased a bushel of oysters from a vendor near the dock. Oysters spoiled quickly in summer heat and were a known source of illness. She also bought a quantity of peaches, some already softening. Both items would be served at the supper, creating a plausible origin for any gastric complaints. If questioned later, she could truthfully say that Thomas had eaten oysters and peaches, and that she herself had felt unwell afterward, a shared affliction, not a targeted attack. She returned to Merrick Hall and instructed Cook to prepare the oysters for the supper. Cook examined them and frowned. "These are past their best, ma'am. They should have been eaten yesterday." "They'll do," Constance said. "Serve them cold, with lemon and vinegar. That will mask any off flavor." Cook said nothing, but her expression conveyed doubt. Constance ignored it. The next obstacle was the wine. She had selected 2 bottles of Madeira and 2 of brandy from the cellar, both of which had been laid down years earlier and were presumed sound. But she needed to mark Thomas's glass so that she could ensure only he drank from it. She considered several methods: a chip in the rim, a faint scratch on the base, a specific placement at the table. In the end, she chose the simplest. She would use a set of crystal glasses that had belonged to Nathaniel's mother, 6 in total, each slightly different in size and etching. She would give Thomas the largest glass, the one with the grapevine pattern, and serve him first. The other guests would receive the smaller glasses. It was a subtle distinction, easily overlooked, but sufficient for her purposes. On the 1st of July, she conducted a rehearsal. She set the dining table as it would appear on the evening of the supper, placing the grapevine glass at the head of the table where Thomas would sit. She poured water into each glass and practiced the sequence of service. First Thomas, then Mr. Grayson, then herself. She timed the intervals between courses. She calculated how long it would take to administer the poison in stages: 10 drops in the first glass, poured while the guests were seated; 20 drops in the second, poured after the main course; 30 in the brandy served with dessert; and 10 more in a final cordial, if Thomas was still conscious enough to drink it. The rehearsal took an hour. When she finished, she cleared the table herself and returned the glasses to the sideboard. Letty entered as she was placing the last glass on the shelf. "You want me to wash those, ma'am?" Letty asked. "No, I'll see to them later." Letty hesitated. "You feeling all right, ma'am? You've been spending a lot of time in here." "I'm quite well. Is there something you need?" "No, ma'am. Just..." Cook was asking about the menu. "She says oysters in July aren't a good idea. Says they'll make people sick." "Tell Cook to follow my instructions." Letty withdrew, but Constance felt the weight of her gaze. The household staff had grown watchful. They were not stupid. They had seen the foreclosure notice, even though she had never shown it to them. They knew the estate was in jeopardy. They also knew that their own fates depended on the outcome. If Merrick Hall was sold, they would be sold with it. If Thomas assumed control, they would pass to him. If Constance retained ownership, they would remain under her authority. Every decision she made was scrutinized, every deviation from routine noted. She could not afford mistakes. On July 2nd, the weather turned. The temperature climbed past 90 degrees and the air grew thick with humidity. Thunderstorms rolled in from the coast, brief and violent, leaving the roads muddy and the fields steaming. The heat made sleep difficult. Constance lay awake in her chamber, listening to the rain hammer against the shutters and the distant rumble of thunder over the river. She thought of Thomas, traveling toward her through this weather. She thought of the supper, now only 3 days away. She thought of the moment when she would pour the first glass and hand it to him, and whether her hand would tremble. It would not. She would not allow it. On the morning of July 3rd, she received an unexpected visitor. Reverend Whitmore, the rector of St. Helena's Parish, arrived on horseback just after breakfast. He was a lean man in his 50s, with a scholar's stoop and a habit of peering over his spectacles when he spoke. Constance met him in the parlor and offered tea, which he declined. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said. "I was in the area and thought I'd call. We haven't seen you at services in some weeks." "I've been occupied with estate matters," Constance said. "You understand." "Of course. These are difficult times for you. I wanted to offer whatever assistance the parish can provide." He paused, then added, "I also wanted to inquire about your plans. There's been talk in town that you might be leaving Merrick Hall." "Talk?" Constance kept her voice level. "From whom?" "Oh, you know how it is. People hear things. A foreclosure notice, a visit from your brother-in-law. They draw conclusions." He smiled gently. "I'm not here to pry. I simply want you to know that the church community stands ready to help. If there's anything we can do, prayers, counsel, financial assistance, you have only to ask." Constance studied him. His concern appeared genuine, but she knew that anything she said to Reverend Whitmore would be repeated in some form, to the parish council, and thence to the town. She chose her words carefully. "I'm grateful for your concern, Reverend. The truth is, I am in discussions with my brother-in-law about the future of the estate. He's visiting this week to finalize matters. I expect the situation will be resolved shortly." "I'm relieved to hear it. And will you be staying on here?" "That remains to be seen." He nodded, accepting the ambiguity. They spoke for a few more minutes, about the heat, the roads, the upcoming church social planned for the end of July, and then he departed. Constance watched from the window as he mounted his horse and rode down the Oak Avenue. She felt a tightness in her chest. The visit had been a warning, whether Reverend Whitmore intended it as such or not. People were watching. The town was waiting to see what she would do. She could not fail. That afternoon, she made a final trip to the cellar. The space was cool and dim, lined with shelves of preserves, smoked meats, and wine. She selected the 2 bottles of Madeira she had chosen earlier and examined them by candlelight. The seals were intact, the labels faded but legible. She uncorked 1 bottle and sniffed. The wine smelled rich and slightly sweet, with no hint of spoilage. She poured a small amount into a glass and tasted it. The flavor was complex. Dried fruit, caramel, a faint nuttiness. It was excellent wine, the kind Thomas would appreciate. She set the glass down and removed the bottle of Fowler's solution from her apron pocket. She had carried it with her all day, wrapped in a handkerchief. She held it up to the candlelight and measured the remaining liquid. 3/4 full. Enough for her purposes with some to spare. She practiced the motion once more. Uncork the bottle, tilt it over the glass, count the drops. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The drops fell silently into the wine, disappearing without a trace. She swirled the glass. The color was unchanged. She sniffed it. The scent of the Madeira masked any metallic undertone. She did not taste it. She had no intention of poisoning herself, but she was satisfied that the addition could not be detected. She poured the glass back into the bottle, recorked it, and returned it to the shelf. Then she climbed the cellar stairs and locked the door behind her. On July 4th, Independence Day, the town of Beaufort held a small celebration. Constance did not attend. She claimed fatigue, which was not entirely a lie. She had not slept well in days. Instead, she spent the day in final preparations. She inspected the guest chamber where Thomas would sleep, ensuring the bed was made with fresh linens and the wash basin filled. She reviewed the menu with Cook once more, insisting that everything be ready by 6 o'clock on the evening of the 5th. She polished the silverware herself, laying each piece in its proper position on the dining table. She lit a candle in the parlor and rehearsed her greeting, the words she would use when Thomas arrived. By evening, the house was ready. She stood in the dining room and surveyed the table. The good china gleamed in the candlelight. The crystal glasses, including the grapevine glass, were arranged precisely. The room smelled of beeswax and lemon oil. Everything was in order. She walked to the window and looked out over the grounds. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of fireworks from the town celebration, small pops and crackles like distant gunfire. She thought of Nathaniel, buried in the churchyard beneath a stone that bore his name and the dates of his too short life. She thought of the debt he had left her, the choices he had made, the consequences she now carried. She felt no anger toward him, only a cold, clear resolve. She would do what needed to be done. She would survive. Thomas Merrick and Mr. Grayson arrived at 5:30 on the evening of July 5th. Constance heard the carriage on the gravel drive and stepped onto the portico to receive them. The heat had broken slightly. The thermometer in the hall registered 87 degrees, but the air remained thick with the weight of coming rain. Thunder rumbled in the distance, low and intermittent, like artillery heard across water. Thomas descended first. He was a broad man, taller than his late brother, with graying hair combed back from a high forehead and a manner that suggested both confidence and impatience. He wore a dark frock coat despite the heat, and his collar was damp with perspiration. Mr. Grayson followed, lean and precise, carrying a leather document case. Both men removed their hats as they approached. "Constance," Thomas said, taking her hand briefly. "You're looking well. Thank you for coming. The journey wasn't too difficult, I hope." "The roads are passable. We made good time." He glanced toward the house. "Everything is in order?" "Everything is ready. Supper will be served at 6. I thought we could review the documents afterward, when it's cooler." Mr. Grayson nodded. "That will be satisfactory. I have the transfer papers prepared. It should be a simple matter of signatures and witnessing." Constance led them inside. The entrance hall was dim and cool, the shutters drawn against the afternoon sun. Letty appeared to take their hats and gloves. Constance directed the men to their chambers. Thomas in the guest room on the second floor, Mr. Grayson in the smaller room adjacent. She informed them that water for washing had been provided and that she would expect them in the parlor at 5:45. When they had gone upstairs, she returned to the kitchen. Cook was arranging oysters on a serving platter, their shells already opened, the flesh glistening with brine. The smell was sharp and faintly metallic. Constance inspected them closely. Several showed signs of discoloration at the edges. "These will do," she said. "Serve them with lemon and vinegar, as I instructed." "Yes, ma'am." Cook's voice was flat. Constance moved to the sideboard where the wine and glasses had been arranged. 2 bottles of Madeira, 2 of brandy, and the crystal glasses, 6 in total, though only 3 would be used. She located the grapevine glass and held it to the light. The etching was clear, unmistakable. She set it apart from the others and checked the bottle of Fowler's solution in her apron pocket. Still there, wrapped in linen. Her hand was steady. At 5:45, she entered the parlor. Thomas and Mr. Grayson were already waiting, both freshly groomed, their coats brushed. Thomas stood by the window looking out over the lawn. Mr. Grayson sat in a chair near the hearth, though no fire had been lit. The room smelled of beeswax and the faint mustiness of upholstery that had absorbed too many humid summers. "I trust your rooms are comfortable," Constance said. "Quite comfortable," Mr. Grayson replied. "It's a handsome house. A shame to see it in such straits." Thomas turned from the window. "It doesn't have to be. That's why we're here." He looked at Constance directly. "I want you to know I have no intention of dispossessing you. You'll have a place at Prospect Point for as long as you need it. This arrangement benefits both of us." "I understand," Constance said, "and I'm grateful." She offered them sherry while they waited for supper. Both accepted. She poured from a decanter and handed them each a glass, taking a small one for herself. The sherry was dry and pale, a wine she had not touched. They drank sparingly and spoke of inconsequential matters: the weather, the roads, news from Charleston. At 6:05, Letty appeared at the door and informed them that supper was ready. The dining room was lit by candles set in silver holders at either end of the table. The shutters had been opened to admit what little breeze stirred in the evening air, and through the windows Constance could see the darkening sky, heavy with unshed rain. She directed Thomas to the head of the table, Mr. Grayson to his right, and took her own place at the foot. The grapevine glass had been positioned at Thomas's place. The other glasses, smaller, plain, stood at Mr. Grayson's and her own. Letty brought in the oysters first. The platter was set on the sideboard, and Constance rose to serve. She used silver tongs to transfer 6 oysters to Thomas's plate, 4 to Mr. Grayson's, 3 to her own. She offered lemon and vinegar from small cruets. Thomas squeezed lemon liberally over his oysters and began eating at once. Mr. Grayson was more cautious, sniffing one before consuming it. Constance ate one of hers, noting the faint bitterness beneath the brine. She pushed the others aside and dabbed her napkin to her lips. "Excellent oysters," Thomas said, finishing his 6th. "Fresh this morning?" "Yesterday," Constance said, "from the Beaufort market." "Ah, well, they're fine regardless." Mr. Grayson set down his fork after 3. "A bit strong for my taste, but well prepared." When the oyster plates were cleared, Letty brought in the soup, a clear broth with rice and herbs. Constance served it from a tureen at the sideboard. The portions were modest. Thomas finished his quickly and commented on the seasoning. Mr. Grayson ate more slowly, pausing between spoonfuls to dab his mouth with his napkin. Constance tasted hers but took only a few bites. The soup was followed by cold chicken, sliced thin and arranged on a platter with greens from the garden. This Constance also served, placing larger portions before Thomas and smaller ones before Mr. Grayson. She took almost nothing for herself, claiming the heat had diminished her appetite. Thomas ate steadily, methodically, the way a man eats when food is fuel rather than pleasure. Mr. Grayson picked at the greens and left most of the chicken. It was time for the wine. Constance rose and went to the sideboard. She uncorked the first bottle of Madeira and poured a measure into Thomas's grapevine glass. Then she turned slightly, shielding the glass with her body, and removed the bottle of Fowler's solution from her apron pocket. She tilted it carefully over the glass and counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The drops fell silently into the dark wine. She swirled the glass gently, watching the liquid blend, and then carried it to Thomas. "Madeira," she said, setting it before him. "From the cellar. Nathaniel laid it down in 42. "Excellent," Thomas said. He lifted the glass, sniffed, and drank a generous swallow. "Very fine indeed." She poured wine for Mr. Grayson and herself from a separate bottle, using the plain glasses. She resumed her seat and raised her glass. "To resolution," she said. Thomas lifted his glass in return. "To resolution." They drank. The conversation continued. Estate matters, cotton futures, the likelihood of more rain. Thomas drank steadily, finishing his first glass before the chicken was cleared. Constance refilled it promptly, adding 10 more drops of Fowler's solution while standing at the sideboard. He accepted the second glass without comment, and drank half of it before the next course arrived. The next course was summer pudding, a molded dessert of bread and berries that Cook had prepared that morning. Constance served small portions. Thomas ate his without pause, washing it down with the remainder of his second glass of Madeira. Mr. Grayson declined the pudding, citing the richness of the meal. By now it was 6:30. The candles had burned down an inch, and the room had grown darker. Rain began to fall, a light patter at first, then heavier, drumming on the roof and splashing against the windowsills. Constance rose again and brought out the brandy. She poured a large measure for Thomas, using the grapevine glass once more, and this time added 20 drops of the solution. Her hands did not shake. She carried the glass to him and set it down. "Brandy," she said, "to settle the meal." Thomas accepted it with a nod and drank deeply. Mr. Grayson took a smaller measure, sipping cautiously. Constance poured a thimbleful for herself and did not drink it. The conversation had turned to the specifics of the transfer. Mr. Grayson opened his document case and withdrew several sheaves of paper, which he spread on the table. He began explaining the terms. Thomas would assume the mortgage, Constance would relinquish her dower claim, the enslaved workers would pass to Thomas's ownership, the house and land would be held in trust, pending full repayment of the debt. Constance listened, but said little. Thomas drank his brandy and poured himself a second glass from the bottle on the table. Constance did not stop him. It was 7:15 when Thomas first showed signs of distress. He had been speaking, explaining something about shipping contracts, when he paused mid-sentence and pressed a hand to his stomach. "Are you all right?" Mr. Grayson asked. "Fine," Thomas said. "Just a twinge. Too much rich food, I expect." He resumed speaking, but his voice had lost some of its earlier vigor. A few minutes later, he set down his brandy glass and shifted in his chair. His face had gone pale, and a faint sheen of perspiration appeared on his forehead. "Thomas?" Constance said. "I'm not feeling quite myself." He stood abruptly, gripping the edge of the table. "Excuse me, I need a moment." He left the room, walking quickly toward the hall. Constance and Mr. Grayson exchanged glances. "Perhaps it was the oysters," Mr. Grayson said. "They didn't taste entirely fresh." "I hope it's nothing serious," Constance said. They waited in silence. Outside, the rain intensified and thunder rolled closer. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Constance rose and stepped into the hall. She could hear sounds from the direction of the washroom, retching, low groans, the splash of water. She returned to the dining room. "He's ill," she said quietly. "I should check on him." She climbed the stairs and knocked on the washroom door. "Thomas?" "I'm all right," came the reply, though his voice was strained. "Just a moment." She waited. When he emerged, his face was ashen and damp. He leaned against the doorframe, breathing heavily. "I think it was the oysters," he said. "My stomach is in revolt." "You should lie down," Constance said. "Let me help you to your chamber." She guided him down the hall to the guest room and helped him onto the bed. He lay back with a groan, one hand pressed to his abdomen. His breathing was shallow and rapid. "Shall I send for Dr. Bellamy?" she asked. No, it will pass. Just need to rest." She left him and returned downstairs. Mr. Grayson was standing in the hall, looking concerned. "He's resting," Constance said. "It seems to be a gastric complaint, probably the oysters, as you suggested. Should we postpone the signing?" "Perhaps that would be wise. Let's see how he is in the morning." Mr. Grayson agreed and retired to his own chamber, taking the documents with him. Constance returned to the dining room and began clearing the table. Letty appeared to help, but Constance sent her away, saying she preferred to do it herself. She collected the glasses. The grapevine glass still bore the residue of brandy, and carried them to the kitchen. She washed them carefully, one by one, in a basin of hot water, then dried them and returned them to the sideboard. She emptied the remaining Madeira into a slop jar and rinsed the bottle. She corked the second bottle of Madeira and the unused brandy and returned them to the cellar. The bottle of Fowler's solution went back into her apron pocket. Upstairs, Thomas's condition worsened. Constance checked on him at 8 o'clock and found him curled on his side, shivering despite the heat. His skin was clammy, his lips dry and cracked. A basin beside the bed held evidence of vomiting. Thin, watery bile streaked with traces of blood. "I can't stop," he gasped. "Everything I've eaten." "I'm sending for Dr. Bellamy," Constance said. "Yes, please." She dispatched Jonah on horseback to Beaufort with instructions to bring the doctor as quickly as possible. The boy left at once, riding into the rain-soaked night. Constance returned to Thomas's chamber and sat in a chair beside the bed. He drifted in and out of coherence, sometimes speaking in fragments. The contracts, the papers, tell Grayson, and sometimes simply moaning. By 9 o'clock, he was vomiting again, violently, his body convulsing with the effort. The vomit was now flecked with darker material, and the smell was foul. Constance held the basin and wiped his face with a damp cloth. His eyes, when they opened, were unfocused and glassy. "Thirsty," he whispered. She brought him water. He drank a few sips and immediately brought them back up. At 9:30, Mr. Grayson knocked on the door and entered. He stood at the foot of the bed, staring at Thomas with an expression of alarm. "My God," he said. "He's in a bad way." "I've sent for the doctor," Constance said. "Do you think it's cholera?" "I don't know. It came on very suddenly." "The oysters," Mr. Grayson said again, almost to himself. "I knew they smelled off." Dr. Bellamy arrived at 10 o'clock, soaked from the rain, his medical bag in hand. He examined Thomas quickly. Pulse, eyes, tongue, abdomen. Thomas flinched when the doctor pressed on his stomach and cried out weakly. Dr. Bellamy listened to his chest with a stethoscope, checked his pupils, and asked Constance a series of questions. What had he eaten? When did the symptoms begin? Had he complained of pain before vomiting? She answered each question calmly, precisely. The oysters, she said, had been purchased the day before. Thomas had eaten 6 of them. The symptoms began about an hour after supper. He had mentioned a twinge in his stomach but attributed it to overeating. Dr. Bellamy nodded and opened his bag. He prepared a tincture of laudanum and instructed Constance to give Thomas 10 drops if the pain became unbearable. He also left a supply of chalk powder to be mixed with water, which he said might help settle the stomach. Then he straightened and looked at Constance gravely. "It's gastric fever, most likely brought on by tainted food. The oysters, I would guess. We've seen several cases this summer. The heat spoils shellfish quickly." He paused. "He's very ill. The next 12 hours will be critical. If the vomiting continues, he'll lose too much fluid, and that can be fatal. Keep him as comfortable as possible. I'll return in the morning." "Thank you, doctor." He left, and Constance resumed her vigil. Thomas alternated between violent purging and fitful, shallow sleep. His skin grew colder, and his pulse, when she checked it, was weak and thready. By midnight, he had stopped responding to her voice. His breathing was labored, rattling in his chest. Mr. Grayson came to the door once more, looked in, and withdrew without speaking. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Thomas's breathing changed. It became slower, more irregular, punctuated by long pauses. Constance sat beside the bed, her hands folded in her lap, and watched. She felt no satisfaction, no relief, only a cold, numbing exhaustion. The candle on the bedside table had burned low, its flame guttering in the drafts from the open window. The rain had stopped, and the air smelled of wet earth and ozone. Thomas drew one final shuddering breath and went still. Constance waited a full minute, listening for another breath. There was none. She reached out and placed 2 fingers against his neck, feeling for a pulse. Nothing. She closed his eyes and pulled the sheet up over his face. Then she stood, smoothed her skirt, and went to wake Mr. Grayson. Dr. Bellamy returned at first light. Constance met him in the hall, still wearing the dress she had worn to supper, now rumpled and stained with sweat. She had not slept. Mr. Grayson descended the stairs as the doctor removed his hat, his face drawn with exhaustion and grief. "He's gone," Constance said quietly. Dr. Bellamy climbed to the guest chamber and performed his examination. He spent 15 minutes with the body, checking for signs of lividity, rigor, and examining the basin that still held traces of vomit. When he returned downstairs, he carried his notes in one hand. "The cause appears to be acute gastric fever, likely brought on by contaminated shellfish," he announced. "The symptoms are consistent: violent purging, dehydration, collapse of the circulatory system. I've seen 3 similar cases this summer, all fatal." He looked at Constance. "Did you or Mr. Grayson experience any illness after the meal?" "I felt queasy," Constance said. but nothing severe. I ate very little. Mr. Grayson nodded. I took only a few oysters. They tasted off, but I thought nothing of it at the time. Dr. Bellamy made a notation in his book. The oysters, then. Mr. Merrick consumed more than either of you? 6, Constance said. Perhaps more. I wasn't counting precisely. That would explain it. The dose makes the poison, as they say. Dr. Bellamy closed his notebook. I'll inform the coroner. There will need to be an inquest, given that Mr. Merrick died away from his own residence. It's a formality, but required by law. The inquest was held 2 days later in the parlor of Merrick Hall. Coroner Pendleton arrived from Beaufort with 6 jurors drawn from the surrounding properties. Planters and merchants, men Constance knew by name if not by friendship. They assembled at 10 o'clock on the morning of July 8th, the house sweltering despite open windows and drawn shades. Thomas's body had been prepared by the undertaker and lay in a sealed coffin in the dining room, awaiting transport to Charleston for burial in the family plot. Coroner Pendleton was a compact man with thinning hair and a methodical manner. He swore in the jury, explained the purpose of the proceeding, and called his first witness, Dr. Bellamy. The doctor testified to his examination of Thomas Merrick, describing the symptoms observed, the progression of illness, and his conclusion that death resulted from acute gastric poisoning consistent with contaminated shellfish. He noted that such deaths were common in summer months and that he had personally attended similar cases. No autopsy had been performed. Dr. Bellamy saw no reason to subject the family to such an indignity when the cause was evident. Mr. Grayson testified next. He described the supper in precise detail, the courses served, the quality of the food, the oysters that had tasted slightly off. He confirmed that Mr. Merrick had eaten substantially more than either he or Mrs. Merrick, and that the deceased had remarked during the meal that the food was excellent. Mr. Grayson also stated that he himself had experienced mild digestive upset following the meal but had recovered by morning. Constance was called last. She stood before the jury and answered Coroner Pendleton's questions in a steady voice. Yes, she had purchased the oysters from the Beaufort market on the 4th of July. Yes, she had instructed cook to serve them cold with lemon and vinegar. No, she had not noticed any foul smell or discoloration at the time of purchase, though in hindsight they may have been kept too long in the heat. Yes, Mr. Merrick had eaten heartily and complimented the meal. No, she had no reason to suspect anything amiss until he became ill. The coroner asked if there were any tensions between herself and the deceased. She replied that Mr. Merrick had been assisting her with estate matters following her husband's death, and that their relationship had been cordial. The coroner asked if Mr. Merrick had any known enemies. She said she knew of none. The coroner asked if there were any medicines or tonics in the house that Mr. Merrick might have consumed. She listed the contents of the apothecary case: laudanum, camphor, Fowler's solution. The coroner asked if Mr. Merrick had access to these. She said the case was kept in the parlor and was not locked, but to her knowledge Mr. Merrick had not used any of the remedies. The jury deliberated for 20 minutes. They returned a verdict of death by misadventure, specifically acute gastric poisoning caused by consumption of tainted oysters. No criminal act was suspected. No further inquiry was deemed necessary. The coroner signed the death certificate and released the body for burial. Thomas Merrick was interred in Charleston 3 days later. Constance did not attend. She claimed the heat and her own fragile health made travel inadvisable, and sent Mr. Grayson in her stead with a wreath of white lilies. The funeral was sparsely attended. Thomas had been a businessman, not a socialite, and the rector of St. Michael's Church delivered a brief homily on the unpredictability of Providence. The legal consequences of Thomas's death emerged slowly, like sediment settling in still water. Mr. Grayson returned to Merrick Hall on July 15th and met with Constance in the counting room. He spread the estate documents across the desk, the same documents that had been prepared for Thomas to sign, and explained the situation with the careful neutrality of a man navigating treacherous ground. Thomas Merrick had died intestate. He had no wife. No children, no direct heirs. Under South Carolina law, his estate would pass to his surviving relatives, a cousin in Virginia and 2 nephews in Georgia, none of whom Constance had ever met. More significantly, Thomas had died before assuming the Merrick Hall debt. The agreement he and Constance had discussed, the transfer of property in exchange for debt assumption, had never been formalized. The bank's lien remained in force, the foreclosure deadline unchanged. "In short," Mr. Grayson said, "you are no better off than you were before Mr. Merrick's visit. In fact, you may be worse off. The bank will hear of his death and may accelerate the foreclosure, fearing you have no other recourse." Constance sat in silence for a long moment. Then she asked, "What if I were to negotiate directly with the bank, offer a partial payment to extend the deadline?" "With what funds?" "I have my widow's portion, jewelry, some household silver. It might be enough to demonstrate good faith." Mr. Grayson looked doubtful. "It's worth attempting, I suppose. But Mrs. Merrick, I must speak plainly. Your position is precarious. If you cannot satisfy the debt, you will lose everything. Have you considered what you'll do if the bank refuses?" "I'll face that when it comes." She rode to Charleston 2 weeks later, on a day when the heat had broken enough to make travel bearable. She carried letters of introduction from Mr. Grayson and a small valise containing a silver tea service and 3 pieces of jewelry: her wedding ring, a pearl necklace, and a brooch that had belonged to Nathaniel's mother. At the State Bank of South Carolina, she met with Mr. Hackett, the manager who had signed the foreclosure notice. Mr. Hackett was a lean man in his 60s, with the expression of someone perpetually disappointed by humanity. He listened to Constance's proposal, a payment of $800 raised from the sale of personal items, with a request to extend the deadline by 6 months, with visible impatience. When she finished, he set his hands flat on the desk. "Mrs. Merrick, the bank is not in the business of charity. Your late husband borrowed against collateral. That collateral is now subject to seizure. An additional 6 months will not change your fundamental situation unless you can demonstrate a credible plan to satisfy the full debt. Do you have such a plan?" "I'm seeking investors. There are gentlemen in Beaufort who may be willing to invest in a failing plantation run by a widow with no experience and no male relations to vouch for her." Mr. Hackett's tone was not cruel, merely factual. "Mrs. Merrick, I sympathize with your circumstances, but I answer to the bank's board, and the board has no interest in prolonging an arrangement that shows no prospect of repayment." She left the bank empty-handed and returned to Merrick Hall. On the ride back, she passed through the town of Beaufort and saw an auction in progress, a small estate sale, furniture and household goods spread across a lawn. A crowd had gathered, bidding listlessly in the heat. She did not stop. The foreclosure proceeded on schedule. On August 20th, a representative of the bank arrived with a writ of seizure. Constance signed the necessary documents in the counting room, her hand steady. The representative informed her that the auction would be held in Beaufort on September 10th. All property enumerated in the lien, land, buildings, livestock, and the 17 enslaved persons, would be sold to the highest bidder. Mrs. Merrick was entitled to retain her personal effects and a widow's portion of any proceeds after the debt was satisfied. It was unlikely there would be proceeds. She had 30 days. She spent them cataloging what would be lost. She walked the grounds of Merrick Hall, room by room, noting the furniture Nathaniel's father had commissioned, the portraits of ancestors whose names she barely remembered, the books in the library that no one had read in years. She visited the quarters and spoke with Samuel, the foreman, telling him plainly what was coming. He listened without expression and asked only one question: would the families be sold together or separately? She said she did not know. The bank would decide. On September 8th, 2 days before the auction, Letty came to Constance's chamber and asked if she could speak privately. Constance nodded, and Letty closed the door. "We know what you did," Letty said quietly. Constance's chest tightened. "I don't know what you mean." "Mr. Thomas, we saw how you served him. We saw the glass you used. We're not stupid, ma'am." The silence stretched. Outside, cicadas droned in the heat. Constance met Letty's gaze and saw not accusation but something harder to name, a kind of weary recognition. "Why are you telling me this?" Constance asked. "Because it didn't work. You killed him, and we're still being sold. So I want you to know that we know, and I want you to live with it." Letty turned and left the room. Constance sat on the edge of her bed, hands folded in her lap, and stared at the wall. The auction took place in the courthouse square in Beaufort. Constance did not attend. She remained at Merrick Hall and heard the results from Mr. Grayson, who came to deliver the final accounting 2 days later. The land and buildings had sold to a cotton merchant from Charleston for $3,000. The enslaved workers had been sold individually to various buyers, their families divided. Samuel went to a rice plantation near Georgetown. Bess and the younger children went to a household in Savannah. The infant, Ruth, was sold with her mother. Gabriel and Mary were sold separately. Total proceeds from the human sales, $7,200. After the bank's debt was satisfied, there remained $117. This was Constance's widow's portion. "Where will you go?" Mr. Grayson asked. "I have a cousin in Columbia. She's offered me a room." "I'm sorry it came to this." "So am I." She left Merrick Hall on September 15th, carrying a single trunk. The house stood empty behind her, its shutters closed, its rooms silent. She did not look back. In Columbia, she lived quietly in a boarding house on Senate Street, supporting herself by taking in sewing and giving piano lessons to the daughters of merchants. She attended church but did not socialize. She avoided talk of politics or plantations. When the war came in 1861, she watched the young men march away and said nothing. She died in 1867 of influenza in a rented room above a milliner's shop. She was 52. There was no inquest, no investigation. The death certificate listed her as Constance Merrick, widow, no occupation, no known relations. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the Elmwood Cemetery. But the story did not die with her. In Beaufort, the tale of Thomas Merrick's death circulated quietly through the years. Some said he had been poisoned by tainted oysters. Others whispered that his sister-in-law had killed him to prevent the sale of the estate. Still others claimed he had been the victim of a vengeful servant, one of the enslaved workers who knew the household kept arsenic for medicinal purposes. No version could be proved, and no one cared to try. Thomas Merrick had been a man of business, not a figure of great importance. His death was unremarkable except to those who had witnessed it. The enslaved workers who survived, those who were not sold away or did not flee during the war, carried their own version. They spoke of the widow who had tried to save herself by murdering her brother-in-law, and how the murder had saved no one. They spoke of the families torn apart, the children sold south, the old ones left behind. They spoke of how the house called Merrick Hall stood empty for years, until it was finally torn down and the land turned to cotton again. And they spoke of how some debts could never be repaid, no matter how much blood was spilled. By the turn of the century, Merrick Hall was a name in a county ledger, a plot of land that changed hands 3 times before being subdivided and sold to tenant farmers. The kitchen building survived until 1923, when it burned. The foundation stones remained, overrun with kudzu. In 1957, a historian researching Beaufort County came across the coroner's inquest record for Thomas Merrick and noted it in a footnote. Died July 6, 1849, of gastric poisoning attributed to tainted oysters. No evidence of foul play. Case closed. The historian did not investigate further. There was nothing to investigate. But in the oral histories collected from descendants of the enslaved, interviews conducted in the 1930s by the Federal Writers Project, one name appeared twice. A woman identified only as L, born in slavery, said this when asked about plantation life in the old days. There was a place called Merrick Hall. The missus there killed a man with poison and still lost everything. That's how it was. You could do the worst thing and it wouldn't save you. Nothing saved you but freedom. The second mention came from a man identified as S, interviewed in 1936. My grandfather worked Merrick Hall before the war. He told me about a supper where a man died. Said the white lady did it, but nobody could prove it. Said she used medicine from the house, arsenic, I think. Said she poured it in his glass herself and smiled while he drank it. My grandfather saw her do it. But what could he say? Who would have listened? So the man died, and they sold us all anyway. That's how it went. The tapes were archived in the Library of Congress. Few people listened to them. The land where Merrick Hall stood is now part of a nature preserve, a stretch of coastal woodland marked by trails and interpretive signs that explain the history of rice cultivation and the ecology of tidal marshes. There is no marker for the house. There is no mention of Constance Merrick or Thomas Merrick or the 17 people whose names appeared in a ledger and whose lives were sold to satisfy a debt. But the land remembers. The oak trees that shaded the avenue still stand, gnarled and massive, their roots deep in soil that holds the bones of all who lived and died there. On certain evenings in summer, when the heat lies heavy and the cicadas scream and the air smells of salt and decay, people say they can hear it. A sound like glass being set down on a table, a bell ringing in an empty house, the whisper of a name no one speaks anymore, and the river indifferent flows on.